When someone breaks their leg, what happens? They go in a cast, and then they go to the physio for rehab, and they learn how to walk on it again. And no one ever would choose rehab. It's hard work, it's painful, it's demoralizing. You'd only choose rehab if you were injured. You'd go through the pain so that you can walk properly again. And this part of Hosea is God doing rehab on Israel. He judges and disciplines them, but only so they'll come back to him to be restored. It's all about rehab. Israel have realized that there's something wrong with their nation. Their society is kind of destroying itself. They're not politically strong, and so they're under threat by all the nations around them. Instead of turning to God, though, who provides for them and who protected them again and again, what do? Have a look in verse 13. What do? They turn to Assyria. They're asking the super nation of their day to rescue them, like if you turn to America now or something. Ironically, though, Assyria is the very nation that will actually destroy them in a couple of years' time. So God shares his plan. His plan is to judge them, to discipline and correct them. God says, look at verse 14, God says he will be like a lion who overpowers them. And then, when they're at their lowest, in their misery, verse 15, they will finally seek God instead of seeking help from the Baals and the fake gods and the politics of the nations around them. And here's what they'll say, verse 1, let us go to God. He's disciplined us, but he will heal us. And verse 2, he's going to do that soon. 3 days is all they have to wait. That's all it's going to take for God to restore them. I might remind you of another 3 days that changed everything. Hint, hint. That's what's ahead of them. That's what's ahead for Israel on the other side of God's discipline. But then in verse 4, kind of feels like we go back in time and God comments again on what Israel are like. He says their devotion to him is fleeting. It's as fleeting as like early morning fog on Mount Kira or on Sublime Point. It's like the frost that we're about to get in our car windshields as winter hits Wollongong. It's kind of pathetic. Their love for God is pathetic. But even more pathetic, look in verse 6. They're still being religious and spiritual. They're offering sacrifices and burnt offerings to God, but they're ignoring the God they're giving them to. Kind of reminds me of the Pharisees in Jesus' time when he says to them, you're doing the right things on the surface, but your hearts are so far from God that there's no substance to their worship. It's fake. If that's what they're like, though, then how can that picture in verse 1 to 3 actually come about? How can they turn to God? I mean, do they really have it in them to do that, to turn to God in repentance? And thinking bigger for a second, because Israel is kind of a model to us of what all humans are like, does humanity really have it in us to do that, to turn to God? Well, the answer is no, we don't. But God can do it. Listen to 2 Timothy 2, verse 25. Paul tells Timothy how to talk with enemies of the gospel, and he says opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, that God will grant them repentance. God gives Christians repentance, and God has done that in you and in me if you trust in Jesus. So as Christians who have turned to God to be healed, we need to learn from Israel to be genuinely religious and spiritual, to worship and to know God from the heart. And when we fail to do that and fail to live God's way, as we're bound to do, God's actually going to be kind enough to discipline us too, to do rehab on us. This is what Hebrew 12 said, and you're about to look at this. It says, God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it.